Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is our second virtual seminar in this series for the Social and Decision Analytics Division. It looks like most people here are familiar with our division, but just in case you're not, we're part of the Biocomplexity Institute of the University of Virginia, and our interests are focused on using evidence-based research to inform policy decision-making and evaluation in government and local communities. So if you have questions as you're listening, please enter them in the Q&A tab and we'll hold them and have a question and answer session at the end. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Tessa Conroy. Tessa is an assistant professor and economic development specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, jointly appointed in the Department of Extension, Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics. She earned her PhD in economics from Colorado State University in 2014. She studies community, economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and is especially interested in regional approaches to entrepreneurship. In her role as an extension specialist, her work is focused on analyzing challenges and opportunities for the state of Wisconsin. She also partners with communities to help build entrepreneurial ecosystems through community programs and educational outreach. Welcome, Tessa.
Thanks so much for the introduction. It's so nice to be with all of you today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I hope we have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Today, I'll be sharing about broadband in Wisconsin and in particular UW Extension's role in expanding access. So I want to sort of introduce the way I'm approaching this talk. So what you're looking at right now is a snapshot of the Wisconsin economy. So the Wisconsin economy is a series that we developed as an EDA, Economic Development Administration, University Center. So we have a grant from the EDA that supports a number of our outreach and applied research efforts. And the Wisconsin economy is one of the ways that we communicate that work with the residents of Wisconsin. So with each with each topic, we do a data-driven report that's usually a bit more lengthy for people who want to get into the weeds. We do a policy brief where it's more of a literature review and we look at examples of what other states or regions or communities, what they're doing. And then for people that just want to get the nuts and bolts, we put that information into a series of fact sheets and try to summarize the highlights. So I'll be presenting today some of the work that went into the Wisconsin economy on broadband. I suspect many of you have, quite a bit of information already about broadband. And so I really want this, rather than, to be just about broadband, to be about the way Extension approaches the topic and the way we engage with communities. And this platform is just a vehicle for having that conversation. I want to introduce our team. So I would say, again, this is maybe just the first feature that I would offer about the way we have been working in Extension, is that we really tried to pull together interdisciplinary teams. So Steve Deller and I are both trained as economists. We have Matt Cures, who is our GIS specialist. All of the beautiful maps that you'll be looking at, a lot of the data analysis, we have Matt Cures to think. And then we have Dr. Sarah Lowe at the University of Missouri. Sarah comes to us from the USDA, so she has a federal perspective. She was she was there for Reconnect, and so has that lens that really helped us as well. Wisconsin is a state that has some statutory limitations, some statutory barriers to broadband. So we also invited Jeff Glazer, who's a clinical associate professor in our law school, to really help us understand what those statutes say and what our communities need to know. And then we also invited two county educators or those with educator backgrounds. One is now a specialist. So we have Gail Hike and Chris Stark, and these are people that have been on the ground doing programming with communities, standing next to communities as they apply for grants, getting into the weeds. And so they really have that local lens that we wanted to include also. And just one more contextual slide here. I would say that this sort of model or this diagram captures how we think about our work. And so we see sort of a virtuous cycle between our academic publications, those that are more geared towards peer-reviewed outlets, and then what we're doing on the education and outreach side. And we really strive to have our peer-reviewed work inform our outreach. So we like to have a strong research foundation and have confidence that what we're presenting to communities has been subject to the rigors of peer review, that it's really high quality information, the latest that we can offer them. And then we of course want to be listening to communities as we interact with them, getting their perspective, understanding their questions and problems, and then that informs our research. So we're making sure that we're bringing that input and feedback back into the work so that we can then ultimately share with them information that is useful and relevant to what they're seeing in their communities. And then of course, there's a number of sort of offshoots of this in terms of how we share, but again, this cycle I think is really important to us. So getting into the Wisconsin economy and this report that we did and why we did it. So our motivation started long before the pandemic, that we knew broadband was a challenge, before last March. 14% of households do not have a broadband subscription in Wisconsin. I find that some audiences think that that is quite a lot. I find that other audiences think that that's actually a relatively small number. It's about just a little over 300,000 households. And for comparison, Dane County, which is where Madison is, we're the capital, we're home to the University of Wisconsin. We have about 225,000 households. So we're talking about, the equivalent of a pretty decent sized metro area going without service. We're also learning that it's much more than a modern amenity, that this is not just about watching Netflix at home, that the research was really taking us in a direction to understand that this has real consequences in terms of economic growth. So that's our on-ramp to thinking about broadband as economists. And what we saw is that the pandemic really crystallized those effects for us, those costs for us. So the challenges became more acute, of course, as people go to work, go to school online, as they seek their healthcare online, and even as they recreate. So just being able to watch a show, especially during some of the earlier stages of the pandemic, where we had some more rigid mandates in terms of safer at home orders that we had here in Wisconsin. And so being able to be compliant and then also manage our risk and manage our exposure to the virus, all of that is related to our broadband access. So broadband has made it easier to adjust for those who have it. And again, I think that this was just an opportunity for us to make clearer the costs of going without service. We still interact with communities in Wisconsin who still think of broadband as an amenity to some extent. And so we want to make sure that we know what the costs are going forward, should a community choose to invest or not. So one of the things that I think the report does is help us consider the disparities when it comes to access. So as I mentioned, there are still significant shares of the population without internet. And we have rural to urban disparities. And I would say in Wisconsin that those are fairly well understood, that those are at the front of our minds. And what this report does, I think, is make a little bit clearer the income level disparities. And I think that's important because it sort of takes us into two different conversations. So the rural urban disparities, in my experience, most naturally lead to conversations about infrastructure. So we're talking about addressing supply. And I would say that that's been, the focus in Wisconsin, and my sense is elsewhere as well, is how do we expand access through infrastructure. The income level disparities, which are, I would say, less talked about, at least in our state, lead us maybe to talking about addressing demand, that these have to do with affordability, willingness to pay, demonstrating relevance and education. And so this, I also think, is where extension tries to create some value added. The data that I'll show you, that is going to capture these rural urban disparities, the income level disparities, that's publicly available. We're not necessarily showing communities something that they couldn't access on their own, but I think where extension adds value is saying, okay, but what does it mean? And what it means is something about what needs to be addressed, addressing supply on the infrastructure side, addressing demand, affordability, thinking about comprehensive strategies to expanding access that are addressing multiple issues. So the first graphic I have here, we are looking at the percent of the population without internet access by household income. And we're looking at counties across the rural-urban continuum code. So we have the most rural at the very top, going down to the most urban at the very bottom. So 9 buckets kind of on the continuum of rurality. And then within each bucket, we're dividing, we're looking at access by income group. And I think this is just one way to look at the disparities that we're referring to all at once. So what I see looking at this is going from most rural to most urban across any kind of income level. It is the case that rural places have more people without access. So we see that rural-urban divide. I think what's striking, though, is that within any given level of geography or within any given definition of rurality, the differences between the low-income group and the high-income group are more stark than when we look across from most urban to most rural. And so understanding those income disparities is something that we're trying to bring to light with this graphic. So another way to look at it is geographically with a map. So here we have a census tract level map. We are cross-tabbing FCC data with the American Community Survey. So we're thinking about what does the FCC say about access versus what do households say about their subscription to the internet. And I think this is useful too for talking to communities about understanding data sources and the pros and cons. So what happens when we have a source of data that has come from providers' answers to questions about access versus what households say, and we know they're different. Can we learn anything about those gaps? And each have shortcomings. We try to educate communities about what the shortcomings and limitations are. A lot of communities are experiencing firsthand the limitations of the FCC data, and so those are well known, but just thinking through them and what we can do about it. So with this map, I just want to point out kind of 2 areas that I think are useful for us. So first, in the dark blue, these are the places where the FCC says, okay, there's less access here, and we also have households saying, you know, a fair amount of households saying, no, we don't have internet at home. So kind of more congruence there. And I think those are the regions of the state where we more naturally have those conversations about addressing supply and infrastructure. So in terms of a strategy, that's probably the infrastructure is probably the binding constraint, and that's the thing that we might want to focus on first in those communities. And then looking at the sort of dark gray, or maybe they're dark purple on your screen, the very darkest areas, these are where there are bigger gaps. So the FCC is saying these places have access according to providers, and yet households are saying, well, there's a large share of households saying that they do not have an internet subscription. So that's interesting. So what is happening in these places where the FCC says there is access and yet households aren't subscribing? And we try to have that conversation with communities. So one potential explanation is the quality of data, that the FCC says these communities have coverage or have access and actually do not. And we might want to work with them to do a survey or talk about some of these data alternatives, for example. Another explanation is the income disparities that we were just talking about. So I'll draw your attention to Milwaukee there, kind of on the south east side of the state. And here we have a really urban region, which we would think has access, and yet we have a lot of households saying they do not have service. So, and a lot of where we're looking at in Milwaukee are lower income neighborhoods. So it does point to this affordability conversation. So again, helping communities sort of diagnose what is the constraint, thinking about the range of different issues that might be happening, and trying to work with the data that's available, understanding its flaws, and trying to see where we can maybe get a little bit of traction. So we have a number of maps. I just gave you a sample and figures that help us understand where there is service and where there isn't. And so now that we know the lay of the land in terms of who has access and who doesn't in Wisconsin, the next conversation is, you know, why is that? Why do we even have segments of the population without broadband? And there are a number of explanations that we offer in the report. And I think the first and most obvious to me and how I think about things as an economist is this high cost, low density problem. So just making sure communities sort of know what they're up against in terms of having conversations with providers. So infrastructure being expensive to build and implement. And that could be because of pole attachment fees. That could be because of difficult terrain. So infrastructure is expensive to build. And internet service providers are going to be weighing those costs against their potential customers. In a rural area with low density, that potential benefit for providers is much smaller. It can be even smaller still if we're dealing with low take rates. So the share of people that we expect to take up service, would it be available? So if we have low density combined with sort of low demand, which amounts to low take rates, that calculus for providers isn't going to work out. And we just try to convey this with some simple examples. We looked at a couple of sources for cost information and found, I think it was a consulting report that seemed reasonable, and kind of give this example of fiber can really range in expense from maybe $10,000 per mile up to $85,000 per mile. And then we introduce density into that conversation. So let's choose a more conservative amount, $12,000 per mile to lay fiber. And this is, an imperfect example, but just in terms of conveying to communities what that cost structure might look like and what a big difference density can make. We look at Richland County, 31 people per square mile. So at 12,000 per mile for laying fiber, that might amount to close to $400 per person. So the expenses that they're looking at. In Outagamie County, 277 people per square mile. So in that same cost in a much denser community comes out to about $50 per person. So orders of magnitude different in cost, and just helping communities understand that cost structure and understanding the implications of density for broadband. So here we just have this relationship between county level density and access to broadband, and showing kind of where these two communities are in the spectrum.
And Tessa, I'm watching chat and I have a quick clarifying question from John Pender, who asks, can you clarify what exactly you mean by access when you say access to broadband?
So in these maps, we're using FCC data. So access is availability based on the provider's perspective, 225.3. So we're using the definition of broadband. I hope that answers the question.
So can I follow up?
Yeah, hi, Jeff.
Hi, Tessa. So FCC has two kinds of data, right, from the Form 477. They've got data where they have the number of providers in a census block, and then the FCC uses that to come up with a supposed estimate of households that have access, have availability, the percent of households that have availability. Then there's also the subscription data where FCC provides estimates at census tract level on the ranges of the share of households that have subscriptions. And then you're also talking about ACS data, which is based on whether they have a subscription. So I'm a little confused. You seem to be using access in two different ways.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So in this report, we do pull from a number of different sources. With the FCC data, we're not using the subscription. It's the share of households with access. So the first one that you were talking about.
Availability.
Yes, thank you. And then we also use the term access sort of based on the ACS data, which is different in the sense that this is households answering this question about, do you have an internet subscription? We try to make that more clear in the report for ourselves, and also for the communities we're working with, just making sure that they have a better sense of the way this is being measured from different sources. So thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so answering these questions about how did we get here. Another answer to this question about how did we get here is capacity. So we talk about the need for technical assistance on grants and initiatives that, anecdotally, our experience in Wisconsin is that the grants can be quite cumbersome for communities to apply in terms of the data needs and knowledge of technology that they need to apply. Perhaps they need GIS files and a number of different components that have to be pulled together, to the effect that current providers might find themselves in the best position to apply in communities at a bit of a disadvantage in some cases. So having that technical assistance so that communities can be competitive is part of the equation. Identifying that local champion or local leader, somebody to sort of take the reins. I would say the way extension has been effective in some cases is there has been either a community group or leader who is the primary author of a grant, or in some cases an internet service provider, a primary author on the grant, and then extension plays a secondary role. So we're just supporting that grant application. But one of the reasons that maybe communities haven't been able to access those grants, and we haven't seen access expand the way we might hope, is just some of those barriers to actually getting the grants in, finding the funding, getting the financing together, these sorts of things, and that's where we hope to be helpful. Data limitations we talked about. If communities are using the FCC data and they're finding that it looks like they have coverage, so can we help them use alternative data? One of the things we've done is try to put together a repository of all the community surveys that have happened in Wisconsin. So if your community has done a survey where you're trying to get a better sense of access, then hopefully we have that survey, and others who want to do the same thing could use that as a model. And then another explanation for kind of how did we get here is the municipal barriers. So Brian Whitaker and Roberto Gallardo, of course, doing great work in this space, just have a recent paper showing that these statutory barriers, which can manifest in a number of different ways, that the states that have these statutory barriers on broadband, and it could be municipal as it is in Wisconsin, or cooperative, so making it either sort of impossible or difficult to have these types of models for providing broadband, those states do have less coverage. So in Wisconsin, the way that looks is, for example, feasibility requirements, that we can't compete, you can't offer service outside of your boundaries, the municipal boundaries. So all of these sorts of things make it sort of feasibly intractable. So it's not outright prohibited, but in effect, all of the barriers that are in place make it quite difficult for a municipality to offer service. But we do have robust cooperative provided broadband. So lots of reasons why we're in this space of looking at expanding access to new populations. So these municipal barriers or statutory barriers are often motivated by sort of preserving competition in broadband, and that's what we have our communities asking us about. We want to protect competition, so we have these barriers, and competition is good in broadband. And I just recently had somebody call me saying, like, this isn't really adding up. And I would say one of our roles in extension is to then advance the conversation where we can. So helping communities think about, okay, so competition, this is an argument that we see often in terms of why we would have these laws in place that prohibit other types of service. Competition, the economist in me, spurs innovation, drives down costs, and often motivates these sorts of protections. But if we were to think geographically, perhaps many rural areas don't have two or more providers. So the conversation about competition is probably irrelevant. If we're talking about 0 or 1 provider, that model isn't the most appropriate, and we might actually encourage some different thinking, different economic thinking about what's happening in that market. So, for example, do we have market failure? Some symptoms of that could be under provision, so we don't have enough service, and high prices. So that can be symptomatic of market power. So do we have, one provider exerting market power? Or do we have positive externalities that we have under provision? The broadband has all of these benefits, not just for you or I, but kind of for our community at large when everybody has access to service. And so based on those positive externalities, might we want to see more people with service? And when we apply these types of economic models, then the space for market interventions through government provision subsidies, that follows more naturally. So just making sure communities have the tools for thinking about their situation and understanding some sort of economic concepts for viewing the broadband issue. Okay, so we've talked about what it looks like in Wisconsin and kind of how we've communicated that. We've talked about some explanations for why we have segments of the population without service. And in this next section, what we've done in Wisconsin is try to help communities understand what are the costs to the economy and community well-being. What are the implications? Is this just an amenity? Is this just about watching Netflix at home, or are there real consequences? And we'll argue that there are consequences across entrepreneurship, population and employment, education, and health. So again, this is just, offering perspective to communities, so as they're weighing their economic development strategies, they sort of know what's at stake. So what are the costs? This is where I tap into broadband is through my work on entrepreneurship. So there's evidence that broadband supports new businesses, fostering entrepreneurship, and specifically, we see that there's more startup activity in places with greater access. We have found that the effect is even larger in the most remote rural counties, also relatively large for small and women-led businesses. From another paper, we find that download speed is more important than upload, so starting to get at some of those characteristics of broadband, and that there are important variations by industry. And I think this is important because the entrepreneurship literature, when we're thinking about regional science, has shown that entrepreneurship is connected to job creation, income growth, and poverty alleviation. So if we can support entrepreneurs by expanding access to broadband, hopefully that would contribute to these broader economic effects as well. What are the costs in terms of population and employment? So one of the things I'll say in these next few figures is we present a number of scatter plots and try to visually represent the relationship. So in our reports and when we're interacting with communities, these types of graphics we find really handy, that they are intuitive for our audiences, but we try to back them up with some regression analysis with our research, and that will often go perhaps in the appendix, or we would refer them to the publication if they wanted to take a deeper dive. But these nice simple graphics are helpful when we're communicating with different types of audiences. So one of the things we found is population growth does seem to be supported by broadband. We have evidence from another research paper that housing values are higher for those houses that have broadband access. So again, there seems to be evidence of this preference for places with broadband. And in economic development, more and more we're thinking about how jobs follow people rather than people following jobs. So what that means for communities is that if they can effectively recruit people into their community, and in which broadband might be a factor in becoming desirable, we might expect to see that talent pool develop, and then hopefully the firms are attracted to that talent pool, and we get, again, these sort of broader economic benefits. I also want to draw attention with communities, we're talking about, the COVID era shifts in telecommuting. If it's the case that people are less anchored to their place of work and have more latitude in choosing where to live, they might choose rural areas where maybe housing is more affordable or it's closer to family, or any number of reasons. But it does seem to be the case that communities with broadband are going to have a leg up in attracting that in-migration. So for some rural communities that have been facing population decline, just helping them think strategically about, here might be an opportunity to chip away at that. We also look at education, and we find this positive relationship between education and broadband across a number of metrics of education, going from kind of young kiddos up through adults with college education. So we looked at third grade reading scores, ACT scores, and the share of population with some college, and we find a positive association across all of those. And again, encouraging communities to think about what are the implications of the COVID era in this finding. So if it's the case that we have sections of the population with less access to education. Of course, that has consequences for that individual person in terms of their ability to gain the skills and training necessary for their work. But when we think about perhaps an entire cohort of people in the community that don't have the level of education or training that they otherwise would have, and what that might mean for worker productivity and the quality of the talent pool, then I think we start to have maybe some more concrete longer term, and people maybe can think more concretely about the gravity of not having broadband and what that means for economic development. So again, here just showing this relationship with a simple graphic. The broadband index, I can go ahead and talk about. One of the things that one of my co-authors did, Steve Zeller, was we're having this conversation about, how do we measure broadband? How do we measure access? And there are any number of ways to do that. FCC data, the ACS has a number of variables looking at access. And in our case, where we were more interested in sort of the general relationship with these measures of community and economic well-being, Steve chose 4 different measures of broadband access and made a principal component access, or principal component index, principal component index. So looking at how these 4 variables that he chose correlate with each other, which has the most explanatory power in the relationship, that gets the greatest weight in the index. And then we can kind of, take some of the guesswork out of maybe which variable we want to be using, and look at that broadband index, or look at that broadband access a little bit more generically, and then the consequences and relationship to these measures of economic well-being. So what are the health costs? Better health outcomes we found in places with greater access. That was measured with the percent of the population reporting poorer for health, as well as the number of poor mental health days, so fewer poor mental health days on average reported in places with greater access. I wanted to share a little bit about a conversation we've been having more and more. Colleagues in public health, I hope to do this justice. I am new to thinking about the social determinants of health, but this has been a great opportunity for us to think about this on an interdisciplinary way. So what I'm learning is how health outcomes are largely determined by socioeconomic factors, and the care that we get from our provider has a relatively small contribution to our overall health outcomes. So if we want to impact health, we need to also be thinking about these social determinants of health. So health has a lot to do with our education, with our income, with the safety of our employment situation, the quality of our employment situation, our overall stress, access to healthy food, safe and high quality housing. And in these conversations with public health, we've come to understand broadband, I'm borrowing language from their literature, but broadband is a super determinant of health. And so broadband is an underlying factor in a lot of what are listed here as the social determinants of health. And so by enhancing broadband, we feed into these social determinants of health, which can hopefully impact residents' health in the long run. So I will say that this framework of using social determinants of health and using or thinking of broadband as a super determinant of health, that was the conversation in which I got the most traction with policymakers. So something I'll talk about in a little later, we have something that we call office hours at the Capitol. Elected officials are invited to come for very short 5-minute presentations on topics. So I was there with a public health expert, and we were talking about this together. And that was just the most engagement. That seems to be the most traction I've had on this topic. So I think it's just a lot to be gained, again, in this sort of interdisciplinary framework. Again, just showing the types of graphics we use and that relationship between fewer poor mental health days and broadband access here with this figure. So got the lay of the land, talked briefly about kind of why we have these gaps and what it's costing us here. And where that takes us is this need for a variety of strategies. So kind of several different challenges depending on where you are in the state. So we think a lot about how do we tailor responses to the community level? What is the local level response to the challenge? So we have sort of the broadband access piece, so the focus on infrastructure. Within that conversation is that a place with access may not actually have access, which points to the data quality challenges. So addressing access having to do with, a number of different pieces that we could think through here, and then broadband adoption. So is it the case that adoption is actually the constraint on expanding access? And that might have to do with affordability, that could have to do with digital literacy. We might need to think about education, demonstrating relevance. So this is more outreach efforts. And communities too, for those that are focused on infrastructure, I think one of the outcomes of this work has been saying yes infrastructure to communities, but also adoption, affordability, thinking about those next steps, and helping communities think about a comprehensive approach to expanding access. A couple considerations for success that we've identified in working with communities is strong leadership. So we really advocate for or follow a community-led model. We sort of resist the expert model. So, in the event that we have a community saying, like, you're the experts, what should we do? We really push back on that and try to offer, the range of possibilities, help them diagnose the problem, help them figure out what is the constraint that they need to address. But really, this is at their leadership, at their request, that we're working with them. Oftentimes, Extension has a role in identifying the person, team, or organization who's going to be that local champion. So, for example, we had a community in northern Wisconsin, and once Extension raised the issue with the economic development organization in their community, and once it became an economic development issue, then we had an entity that was willing to take leadership in a way that others in the community weren't. So, maybe that's a school, maybe that's a chamber, but it was this economic development organization that grabbed onto the issue. And then with Extension started convening meetings. And I think one of the roles Extension has is making sure that we have representation in that leadership group. So an economic development organization, this particular group, all of, a certain demographic. So Extension have a role in, let's include people from various vantage points in the community so that we get a really comprehensive conversation happening around it. And then again, that technical assistance. Can we make sure people understand the technologies, the maps, the funding options, so that we can put together a grant is often where that goes. Partnership with providers in particular is really important. So getting a provider in the conversation. A lot of our grants require a provider partner. Cooperatives, I mentioned, have been really productive in Wisconsin. And then we're trying to also foster the conversation around anchor institutions. So our hospitals, our schools, are they involved in these conversations? Do they have resources to offer, leadership to offer? We have a number of examples from other states where, the hospital or the school has really taken a step towards expanding access, not just for themselves, but for the whole community. And we want to model that as well. And then helping people find data alternative surveys and speed tests and these sorts of things so that they can have some alternatives that more accurately convey what is the status of their need. So that was the report. Again, this is meant to be sort of an overview and talking about different ways in which Extension interacts with communities and how that informs the way we present and share and interact around data. Here with these last few slides, I just want to give a bigger overview of what we've been doing in Wisconsin. So I have sort of three roles that I think we play. So the first is to be an educational resource. And I think we saw that with the Wisconsin economy products, that within each topic, or our topics focus on describing the problem. So in this case, who, where is without process, why we have the problem. So what are the constraints that we are up against, geographical, political, and economic forces, demonstrating those economic costs to community and economic well-being. We anticipate communities getting stimulus funds, for example. So as they're deciding what to do with those funds, I think understanding these costs might help them evaluate if investing in broadband is one of the directions they want to go with those dollars. And then solving the problem. So what are the technology options, and how their terrain maybe plays into that, and their take rates play into that. What are the barriers? Which of their barriers could we move? Which are we going to have to work around? Identifying models that work. So we look at other states, and then again, that technical assistance. We focus on educating extension professionals, so our county educators around the state, elected officials, and partners. So we participate in Community Connect. So that's a program where elected officials can reach out to the Community Connect organization on campus. They are then paired with an expert on the topic that they're interested in. And that service from experts on campus could be anything from, just a phone conversation. It could be an elected official saying, hey, I got this report and I don't know if it's any good. Could you read it for me and sort of vet it? It could be, could you give a presentation? So lots of ways in which we're connecting with elected officials. We also, I mentioned, have these office hours at the Capitol. And then our EDO partners, regional planning commissions, anybody who's sort of in this space. And we use reports. We have topic primers called Windicators. We host monthly and sometimes twice monthly lunch and learn events. We've had the Public Service Commission as a partner of ours come and give a lunch and learn on how to complete a grant, or give information about the grant. So our communities and extension educators are on those calls, learning how those grant programs work, and then of course by request. Educating the general public is one of our activities through media engagement. So a number of us have been on Wisconsin Public Radio. When we did the Broadband series, we partnered with the Wisconsin State Journal so that we could be featured in the newspaper and get the information out that way. Educating legislators, I mentioned these already. And then in particular, just highlighting through one of these office hours at the Capitol events, that was where we had the partnership where I was there with a public health expert, and we sort of tag teamed broadband as a social determinant of health and took that lens on broadband and had a really fun and engaging conversation with our local leaders, which was great. So this is just meant to give an overview, some of what we've done with the Public Service Commission, a screenshot from our webinars, our logo from the office hours at the Capitol. Badger Talks is a Facebook event hosted by our Alumni Foundation, I believe it is. That was blasted out, thousands of people hopefully will eventually view it. So just the different ways we're sort of trying to reach out and touch new audiences and engage with people around the state, making sure that, people just have the best information that they can have for informed decision making. So that first component is the educational resource. The second, developer research foundation. So a lot of us on the team are active in research. One example of the research that we're doing is entrepreneurship, broadband, and gender, evidence from establishment versus rural America. So this was a project with Dr. Sarah Lowe through a cooperative agreement with USDA that's forthcoming in IRSR. And, we just find that these types of projects are what help us think very, very deeply about the broadband issues and help us develop the expertise that we then want to lend to communities. So with this particular project, we were looking at a sample of US rural counties only, using the FCC data to measure access at the county level, looking at startup activity by size and gender, thinking about endogeneity. So, for those of us in thinking about entrepreneurship in the economics literature, is it the case that access to broadband supports entrepreneurial activity, or is it the case that business activity is attracting broadband investment? And so teasing out those causal relationships is important to us. And one of the ways we try to advance it in this paper is with an instrumental variable strategy. So hoping that we've developed some tools that could help advance the literature. And we find that broadband access does enhance rural startup rates, and the effect is again largest in those remote rural counties and for very small and women-led establishments. And I think that that's exciting because as I engage with communities who are pursuing an entrepreneurial economic development strategy, some of those conversations really lean towards resources for high growth entrepreneurs. And I don't necessarily take issue with that. We need high growth entrepreneurs. We want job creation where we can get it. At the same time, if we're thinking about equity, as more and more communities are, broadband does seem to be a strategy that can help entrepreneurs of all types. So the very smallest types of businesses, which tend to be disproportionately owned by people of color, women-led establishments, they're also going to benefit from broadband. So that was one of the reasons I was excited about these findings. We have the need for speed, rural business startup rates, and characteristics of broadband service. So this is where we're trying to get beyond access. This is work with Steve Deller and Brian Whitaker in revise and resubmit right now. So hopefully this is a preview in advance of that work coming out, but where we're trying to get beyond, again, just access and actually look at, does speed matter and how do things vary by industry? And we do find that download speeds, for example, matter more than upload speeds. So, that could be a piece of information that's helpful for ISPs or for communities as they're developing their strategy. And then there's going to be variation across industries. So by implementing broadband, they might be helping some industries more than others. And for communities making strategic choices about what to do with their dollars, that could be a relevant piece of information. Here I'm borrowing from Steve Deller. So we have a piece on rural housing values. This is out in Papers in Regional Science, again, looking at the sample of remote rural counties. And we look at the impact of access on median housing values and find that we do have higher values in counties with greater access, but decreasing returns to speed. So it seems to be the case that having some threshold level of broadband is important, or of internet speed, but beyond that, getting up into really high speeds, we don't see a linear relationship in terms of the value of those houses. So again, this research foundation, we're trying to think on both sides and have this relationship between our peer-reviewed work and our outreach, so that we know that what we're putting out there is rigorous, and we want to be cutting edge and offering our communities the latest and greatest to the extent that we can. And then extension's role, the capacity building. This is the last one that I'll talk about. One of the things that we're doing right now, we have a broadband task force in Extension. They are developing a community preparedness toolkit. So what that is basically a checklist, perhaps, an interactive checklist. So we would imagine, and we have a housing community preparedness toolkit. So it's modeled after that. So an extension educator or a statewide specialist, or together, they would, convene community members, and they would go through this community preparedness checklist, where they go through a series of questions to try to gauge where they are in the process. So has the community, for example, reached out to their nearest internet service providers? Has the community pulled the FCC data and assessed the extent to which that's accurate? Have they administered a survey to understand their community's willingness to pay? Have they engaged with Extension? Have they started a grant process? So we go through all the different types of things. It's meant to be an on-ramp. It's meant to be a starting place for beginners, so that they can understand what activities they should be pursuing, what's maybe already done, what is left to be done, and start developing some teams and strategies for those components. Data, we do the data requests, ACC, FCC, just helping communities understand what's out there. I mentioned the community surveys. We try to be a repository for what's been done in Wisconsin and help communities build off existing knowledge. We don't want to reinvent the wheel if we don't have to. And then we really want to be a partner, a useful partner wherever we can. So a partnership that we have now is the Public Service Commission. That's where our Wisconsin Broadband office is. So one of the things we've done is they have some data that we don't have, and they saw some of our products and wanted to see our data. So can we share resources? They've been really gracious in using our, or agreeing to come to our webinars and share about the grants, to share about what they're learning in the latest pieces of legislation. The Office of Rural Prosperity has been a great partner for us in Wisconsin. They did a number of listening sessions around the state, and Extension was invited to participate in those, of which broadband was a central theme. So again, these partnerships being really important to us. I do have a couple examples here. I think I mentioned them, so maybe I'll just save those and I can weave them into the question and answer time if they're appropriate. But I do want to leave some time in case anybody wants to chat or have a conversation. So I definitely would look forward to that. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope it was worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Tessa. So we have time for discussion. There are a few questions already in chat. So I think what I'll do is I'll just call on you to re-ask your questions. Might be the easiest way to do that. So John, I saw that you had a couple of questions. John, you there?
I don't see John on here anymore. Josh. Oh, no,
Okay.
there he is. He's on. Okay.
Well, Nat, I saw you had a question. Would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. I was just asking, I noticed that you were making comparisons between different geographic locations based on important outcomes related to health, employment, and education as it relates to broadband access. I was wondering if you take into account or control for potential differences in these outcomes for these areas that might have pre-existed the internet, either controlling for them, showing like a relative difference in the magnitude between these differences before I guess the internet came into being and then after the internet?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I guess the answer is it depends. In the most simplistic presentation in the reports, those are of course uncontrolled relationships. So we're just looking at sort of a bivariate kind of scatter plot relationship. That said, we do try to kick the tires at least a little bit. So we have some regression analysis, for example, in the back, which again, I understand is imperfect, but we try to at least control for some of these things, such as the income level, right? This could be a factor that's going to relate to health as well as broadband and that sort of thing. And then with our extended research projects, we're also trying to be alert to the types of issues that you're describing. And we wouldn't want to include something in the report that we knew to be problematic based on that research that we were doing. So I would just say that there's sort of this continuum between what we find communities value and find most useful. And so in that sense, we try to kind of keep it simplistic and direct in the reports, but we are trying to do the kicking the tires, and that's where the research publications and the appendix and those extra regressions that we might not put front and center come in handy.
So, Josh, can I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Hi, Tessa. John again. Yeah, I was stuck in the Q&A box. I clicked on that and then I couldn't get out of that. There was just blank space. But anyway, I had a couple of questions. One was kind of related to what Nathaniel was asking, and that's, you were talking about educational attainment outcomes and then broadband and subscriptions and so on. And we know that causality goes in multiple directions. And so of course, we know that people that are more educated are more likely to get broadband subscriptions for a number of reasons. But is there any research showing the other direction of causality from, broadband subscriptions to improved educational outcomes?
That's a good question. I don't know that we reference anything in the report. The approach we took was to try to share with our audience this issue of reverse causality. And we say, we show these relationships, but it, potentially can go either way. We have some regressions in the appendix that, show that when you control for, these few extra things, you still get this positive relationship. In terms of that literature, I would say that that's, something that we can go further if we get those questions, but that's the shortcoming of the reports is it's just not as comprehensive in terms of the full breadth of literature across all of those topics that we tried to cover.
Thanks. My other question was about price data. You were talking in one slide about the arguments about, free market competition and, is there a market failure? It seems to me like one big failure is the lack of price information. I mean, how can you have a competitive market without, sort of publicly available data on prices?
Yeah, I agree. So we would love to have price data. That's one of the reasons we were excited about the partnership with our Wisconsin Broadband office. Our understanding is that they have some ways or some data sources that could help us understand that. And then even with the price data, again, we've kind of come to understand that, at least it was our impression, we don't really know a lot about rural willingness to pay when it comes to broadband. So this question of what is affordable is also really important and relevant, and the other half of the equation. Oh, excuse me.
Thanks.
Stephanie?
So you had several slides about how you engage with CES, and it seemed really extensive, like you do a lot. Can you tell us a bit more what that looks like day to day or week to week, and how you decide what issues to work on, et cetera?
Sure. So I think no matter who you ask, you would probably get a different answer depending on who you ask an extension. So here's my answer. That I would say that this bubbled up early on. So years ago, right? Extension has learned about the challenge of broadband from our county educators going many years back. So we knew about the issues and were experiencing them with communities through our extension educators. We also at one point had an extension, I'm going to forget the name of the office, but we had a broadband specific unit within extension. And through reorganization that's gone away, but we've still had that expertise. And then that then boils up to the state specialists. So that's folks like me and Steve Deller, and we learn about what's happening on communities, and we think, okay, like, can we show this with some econometric tools? Can we more specifically quantify the effects to have a more rigorous conversation about what's at stake? So then Steve and I started doing research with our colleagues, 2 or 3 years ago, and then the pandemic happened, and it was sort of all hands on deck in terms of thinking about broadband. That was a space where we felt like, okay, we have some expertise. We've been working on this. This is where we can be helpful. And so then we start, game planning. What can we do? Well, it's going to take us a while to complete the report, the Wisconsin economy. But in the medium term, we can do our webinar series. We can invite the Public Service Commission to talk with us and to us about what they have going on. We can start to network our communities so that they can lean on each other if they have any local expertise. We can offer ourselves to Committee Connect and to elected officials so that we can start having those conversations if there's a platform for that. So then once the Wisconsin economy came out, though, then we started getting a lot more attention. So a lot more invitations to speak. So Wisconsin Public Radio said, can we do a special on this? And we said, yes, of course. And so we had one of our county educators participate in sort of a panel discussion. And then the Wisconsin State Journal was really open to doing a special news piece that complemented the Wisconsin economy. And one of the ways we helped them was just putting them in touch with the local people who could tell the story from a firsthand experience that our data was showing sort of generically. So that was one of the roles we had, reaching out to the Alumni Foundation and saying, hey, we have these new products. If there's any way that you'd be willing to help us share those, that would be great. And then again, it's just ongoing with our extension educators. They are getting requests from their local leaders about how to move on broadband. So it's making sure that those educators have the resources they need. So again, the webinars are partly for them so that they are in a position to help with grants, that they understand all of the pieces at play. I'm rambling at this point, but have I answered?
No, that's fine. That's a lot, and it's interesting how many roles you play, and then the different kinds of cooperative extension as well. So thank you.
Yeah,
that was interesting. Thanks for a great talk.
You're welcome. Yeah, glad to be here. Yeah, extension I'm learning too. I have some extension colleagues in other states, and extension is different by a lot from state to state, and the spaces that we work in, and even the sort of organizational structure is really different, and that has implications for the types of roles we take on. So it does vary a lot.
So that timing worked out perfectly. I see it just hit 1 o'clock. So thank you again, Tessa. Very interesting. And to the audience, please stay tuned for upcoming announcements for more seminars in the series. So thank you all.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really a pleasure to be here, and nice to see all of you.